Have you ever noticed something strange? The moment you start pulling back, they begin to act differently? Not in a clear way. Not in a way you can easily understand. Just different. They text at unexpected times. They say things that feel slightly off. They become harder to read. And instead of feeling relief, you feel confusion. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. You thought distance would create clarity. You thought stepping back would bring peace. But instead, it feels like something subtle has shifted. Almost like an invisible tension has entered the space. And you can't quite explain it. At first, you try to ignore it. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You try to stay calm. You try not to overthink. But then, they do something small. A message that feels intentional. A delay that feels calculated. A reaction that feels slightly provoking. And suddenly, you feel pulled back in. Not fully. But just enough to make you question yourself. Why are they acting like this now? Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest, or trying to get my attention? And the more you think about it, the more unclear everything becomes. Because just when you start to detach, they give you something. A little attention. A little curiosity. A little signal. But never enough to feel certain. And that's where it becomes exhausting. Not because of what they're doing, but because of what it's doing to you. That quiet mental loop. Trying to understand. Trying to interpret. Trying to stay in control, while feeling slightly off balance. And deep down, you start to wonder something you can't quite put into words. Why does it feel like, the moment I stop chasing, something begins to test me? Let's slow this down for a moment. Because what you're experiencing feels personal. It feels like something you did triggered this change. Like maybe you pulled back the wrong way. Or said something you shouldn't have. Or created distance that now needs to be fixed. And naturally, your mind tries to take responsibility. It starts analyzing every detail. What changed? What did I do differently? Did I cause this? But here's the truth most people never hear. This isn't your fault. Not in the way you think. You didn't break something. You didn't ruin the connection. You didn't suddenly become less valuable. What you did was change your position in the dynamic. And when that happens, the entire emotional structure shifts. Not because something is wrong, but because something is different. And difference creates uncertainty. Now here's where it becomes important to understand something deeper. Human behavior is not always logical. It's often patterned. People get used to emotional rhythms. Who texts first? Who reaches out more? Who seeks reassurance? Who reacts faster? These patterns create a kind of invisible comfort. Not always healthy, but familiar. And when you pull back, you interrupt that pattern. You don't respond the same way. You don't show up the same way. You don't give the same emotional signals. And suddenly, the other person no longer knows what to expect. That uncertainty doesn't feel neutral to them. It feels like a shift in control. But here's the part most people misunderstand. That reaction from them is not a reflection of your worth. It's a response to a disrupted pattern. And because no one explains this, you internalize it. You think, they're acting differently because of me. They're testing me because I did something wrong. They're pulling away because I lost something. But in reality, you didn't lose anything. You removed predictability. And predictability is something people unconsciously rely on, especially in emotional connections. So when it disappears, They don't always respond with clarity. They respond with behavior. Subtle shifts. Mixed signals. Moments that feel slightly off. Not because they are trying to hurt you, but because they are trying to understand what changed. And they don't always do that consciously. This is where your mind can start to turn against you. Because when something feels unclear, the brain tries to create answers. Even if those answers are wrong. It fills the gaps with assumptions. And those assumptions often lean negative. They're losing interest. They're playing games. They don't value me anymore. But none of those thoughts are grounded in certainty. They're reactions to ambiguity. And ambiguity feels uncomfortable. So your instinct is to fix it. To restore clarity. To go back to how things were. To reach out. To explain. To re-establish the old dynamic. Because that feels safer. Even if it wasn't actually working for you. And this is where most people get pulled back into the same cycle. They mistake discomfort for something being wrong. But discomfort doesn't always mean something is broken. Sometimes, it means something is changing. And change rarely feels stable in the beginning. It feels uncertain. Unclear. Even slightly unsettling. But that doesn't mean you need to correct it. It doesn't mean you need to fix it. It simply means you've stepped into a different space. And your mind hasn't adjusted yet. So instead of trying to solve everything immediately, pause. Not to analyze. Not to control. Just to observe. Notice what you're feeling, without attaching a story to it. Notice the urge to react, without immediately acting on it. Because that urge is not a signal that something is wrong. It's a signal that something is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. It just means new. And the more you allow that space to exist, without rushing to fill it, the more stable you become within it. And when you become stable, everything around you starts to feel different. Not because the other person changed instantly, but because you stopped interpreting everything through pressure. So no. This isn't your fault. You're not being punished. You're not being rejected. You're not losing control. You're simply experiencing what happens when a dynamic shifts. And the mind tries to catch up with it. And once you understand that, you stop reacting from fear. And start observing from clarity. Here's where most people get trapped. Not in the situation itself, but in how they respond to it. Because the moment things start to feel different, they try to fix it. Immediately. They don't pause. They don't observe. They don't allow space. They react. And that reaction usually comes from one place. Discomfort. Not clarity. So what do? They reach out more. They try to re-establish connection. They try to bring things back to normal. They ask subtle questions. They look for reassurance. They try to decode every small change in behavior. And on the surface, it feels logical. If something feels off, fix it. But here's what most people don't realize. That reaction is exactly what resets the old dynamic. The one where you were more invested. More available. More reactive. So even though you pulled back physically, emotionally, you went right back. And the other person feels that. Not through your words, but through your energy. Through your timing. Your tone. Your subtle urgency. And that's when the pattern stabilizes again. Not in your favor, but in familiarity. This is why people say things like, I tried pulling back, but it didn't work. But the truth is, they didn't actually pull back. They changed behavior for a moment. but not their internal state. And that difference matters more than anything. Because pulling back is not about distance. It's about detachment from the need for a specific outcome. And most people don't realize that. They think, if I just text less, they'll come closer. If I just act distant, they'll chase me. If I just change my behavior, I'll get a different result. But underneath all of that, there's still expectation. Still monitoring. Still waiting. Still hoping for a reaction. And that expectation creates pressure. Even if it's silent. Even if it's hidden. And pressure changes how everything is perceived. You start reading into small things. A short reply feels meaningful. A delay feels intentional. A change in tone feels significant. And suddenly, you're not observing reality. You're interpreting it through tension. And that tension pulls you back into reaction. Which brings you back into the same cycle. This is the mistake. Not the pulling back itself, but the intention behind it. Because if your intention is to control their behavior, you're still operating from the same place. Just with a different strategy. And people can feel that. Even if they can't explain it. There's a difference between I'm pulling back to get a reaction and I'm pulling back because I no longer need to chase. One is manipulation. The other is alignment. One creates pressure. The other creates space. And space is what actually shifts dynamics. But space only works when it's real. Not forced. Not calculated. Not used as a tool. Because the moment it becomes a tactic, it loses its effect. And turns into another form of control. Which brings us back to the deeper misunderstanding. Most people think the goal is to change the other person's behavior. But that's not the real shift. The real shift is internal. It's moving from how do I make them respond differently? To why do I feel the need to control their response at all? That question changes everything. Because it redirects your focus. Away from them. And back to you. And when you start looking there, you notice something important. The discomfort you feel is not actually about them. It's about uncertainty. About not knowing where you stand. About not having clear signals. And that uncertainty creates a desire for control. To stabilize the situation. To define it. To make it predictable again. But here's the paradox. The more you try to force clarity, the more unstable everything becomes. Because clarity doesn't come from pressure. It comes from space. From allowing things to reveal themselves naturally. Without constant interference. Without emotional urgency. Without trying to speed up the process. And this is where most people struggle. Because doing nothing feels like losing control. Even when reacting is what's actually creating the instability. So they go back. Back to texting first. Back to checking signals. Back to trying to figure it out. And each time they do, they reinforce the old pattern. The one that keeps them stuck. Not because they don't understand the situation, but because they haven't shifted how they engage with it. And until that changes, nothing else will. Because the dynamic isn't shaped by what you say. It's shaped by how you show up. And if you're still showing up with tension, expectation, and the need for control, then no matter what strategy you use, the result will feel the same. Just in a different form. So the real question isn't, why are they acting like this? The real question is, am I truly detached? Or am I just pretending to be, while still waiting for a response? Because that answer. Now let's go deeper. Because what you're experiencing is not random. It's not unpredictable. And it's definitely not accidental. There is a principle operating beneath all of this. Whether you're aware of it or not. A principle that explains why the moment you pull back, the other person begins to shift. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle, noticeable patterns. This principle is simple. People do not respond to what you say. They respond to what you are certain of. This is something Joseph Murphy emphasized repeatedly. That life and the people within it do not react to surface-level behavior. They respond to the deeper state behind it. Your assumptions. Your expectations. Your internal certainty. Because the subconscious mind, both yours and theirs, is constantly reading patterns. Not words. Patterns. Consistency. Emotional signals. Behavioral rhythms. And when those patterns change, the subconscious notices immediately. Even if the conscious mind doesn't fully understand it. So when you were previously consistent, always available, always responsive, always engaged, a pattern was established. You became predictable. Not in a negative way, but in a stable, expected way. They knew how you would respond. They knew what to expect from you. And that created a certain level of subconscious comfort. But the moment you pulled back, that pattern broke. And this is where the law begins to show itself. Because the subconscious mind does not like uncertainty. It seeks stability. It seeks familiarity. It seeks something it can recognize and rely on. So when predictability disappears, the subconscious begins to check. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But instinctively. It sends signals. Small ones. Subtle ones. A delayed message. A sudden message. A shift in tone. A reaction that feels slightly out of place. These are not random behaviors. They are responses to disrupted certainty. Because when your energy changes, their perception of you changes. And when perception changes, behavior follows. This is why two identical situations can produce completely different outcomes. Because it's not the situation itself. It's the internal state behind it. If your internal state is, I need them to respond a certain way, that creates pressure. Even if you don't say it. Even if you try to hide it. That pressure gets communicated through micro-behaviors. Timing. Tone. Attention. And the other person's subconscious picks up on it. But when your internal state shifts to, I'm okay regardless of how this unfolds, everything changes. Your actions become lighter. Your responses become natural. Your presence becomes less demanding. And that shift removes pressure. But it also removes predictability. And that's where the testing begins. Not as a game. Not as manipulation. But as a subconscious attempt to restore understanding. To answer one silent question. Is the pattern still the same, or has something truly changed? And this is where most people misinterpret what's happening. They think they're playing games. They're trying to control me. They're being inconsistent on purpose. But often, it's not that calculated. It's reactive. Subconscious. Pattern-based. Because when certainty is removed, the mind seeks confirmation. And confirmation often comes through behavior. Not words. This is why you might notice things like, they reach out, then pull back. They show interest, then go quiet. They say something meaningful, then act distant. These are not contradictions. They are signals. Attempts to understand the new dynamic. To feel where they stand. To test whether the old pattern still exists. And here's the most important part of this principle. The response you give to these moments either reinforces the old pattern or establishes a new one. If you react emotionally, if you chase clarity, if you try to stabilize the situation immediately, you signal that nothing has really changed, that the old pattern is still active, and the dynamic resets. But if you remain steady, calm, unreactive, not distant in a cold way, but grounded in yourself, then something different happens. A new pattern begins to form. One where your behavior is no longer driven by reaction, but by internal stability. And that stability creates a different kind of certainty. Not predictable in behavior, but predictable in presence. And that's what changes how people respond to you. Because at a subconscious level, people trust stability more than effort. They respond to consistency of state more than consistency of action. This is what the power of your subconscious mind points toward in its deeper message. That what you hold internally is what shapes external response. Not through force, not through control, but through alignment. So when you pull back, it's not the distance that changes things. It's the shift in your internal state. And that shift disrupts the pattern they were used to, which naturally leads to one outcome. They begin to test, not because they want to play games, but because the subconscious is trying to understand. Who are you now, compared to who you were before? And the way you respond to that question. So now we can finally make this clear. When you pull back, they start testing you. Not because they suddenly changed as a person. Not because they woke up one day and decided to behave differently. But because something fundamental shifted in how you show up. And that shift removes something they were used to. Certainty. Before, your behavior was easy to read. You responded in familiar ways. You showed interest in consistent patterns. You reacted when something felt off. And without realizing it, you gave them a sense of emotional predictability. They knew where they stood. They knew how to engage with you. They knew what would happen if they did or didn't do something. But the moment you pulled back, that predictability disappeared. And when predictability disappears, the mind looks for answers. Not through logic. Through behavior. This is what testing actually is. It's not always intentional. It's not always strategic. It's often subtle. Instinctive. Almost automatic. They might delay responding, to see if you react. They might say something slightly provoking, to see if it affects you. They might give a little attention, then pull it away, to see what you do next. Not necessarily to manipulate you, but to understand. Do I still have the same influence over you? Is the dynamic still the same? Will you respond the way you used to? And this is the part most people get wrong. They interpret these moments as rejection, as disrespect, as games. And sometimes, it can feel that way. But more often, it's uncertainty being expressed through behavior. Because when someone no longer knows how you'll respond, they begin to explore the boundaries. They look for familiar reactions. They look for signs that nothing has really changed. And the moment they find it, the old pattern returns. That's why. If you pull back, but then react emotionally, you cancel out the shift. You show them nothing has really changed. And everything resets. But if you don't react the same way, if you remain steady, if you don't chase clarity, if you don't try to fix every small shift, then something different happens. The testing doesn't immediately stop, but it loses its power. Because testing only works when it creates a reaction. And when there is no reaction, There is no confirmation. And without confirmation, the old pattern can't re-establish itself. This is the real turning point. Not when they change, but when you stop responding from the old version of yourself. Because that's what they're actually interacting with. Not just you, but the version of you they're used to. And when that version is no longer there, they have to adjust. Slowly. Unconsciously. Sometimes awkwardly. But inevitably. And here's the deeper truth. Testing is not a sign that you're losing control. It's a sign that control has already shifted. Because when you were predictable, the dynamic was stable. Now that you're not, it's unstable. And instability forces awareness. It forces attention. It forces recalibration. So instead of seeing testing as something negative, you can begin to see it as a transition. From one dynamic to another. From reacting to responding. From seeking validation to holding your own center. And this is why the way you interpret this moment matters. If you see it as rejection, you'll move closer. If you see it as a game, you'll try to play smarter. But if you see it for what it actually is, a response to your shift, then you don't need to do anything dramatic. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to explain yourself. You simply remain consistent in your new state. Calm. Clear. Unreactive. Not distant in a forced way, but grounded. And over time, this creates a new kind of dynamic. One where you are no longer being measured by how quickly you respond, or how much you react, but by something deeper. Your stability. Your presence. Your certainty. And that's what truly changes how people relate to you. Because at the end of the day, people don't test those who are trying to prove something. They test those who have stopped trying. To see if it's real. And the moment they realize that it is, everything begins to shift. Let's bring this into real life. Because this pattern doesn't just exist in theory. It shows up in everyday situations. Quietly. Consistently. Almost predictably. There was someone who had always been the one to reach out first. Every conversation started with them. Every moment of silence, they filled. Not because they were desperate, but because it felt natural. That was their role in the dynamic. And over time, it became expected. The other person didn't need to initiate. Didn't need to wonder. Didn't need to think twice. Because they already knew. You'll show up. But one day, that changed. Not dramatically. No announcement. No explanation. They simply stopped initiating. At first, nothing happened. A few hours passed. Then a day. Silence. And in that silence, something uncomfortable appeared. The urge to reach out. To restore the familiar rhythm. To go back to what felt normal. But this time, they didn't. They stayed still. And then, something shifted. The other person reached out. Not casually. Not in the usual way. But with a different tone. More attentive. More curious. Slightly uncertain. And over the next few days, the pattern became clearer. Messages would come in. Then slow down. Engagement would increase. Then pull back. Small moments that felt like signals. Not consistent. But intentional. Almost like the other person was trying to figure something out. Because they were. They were adjusting to a new version of the dynamic. One where the old certainty no longer existed. Another situation. Someone who used to react quickly to everything. If something felt off, they addressed it immediately. If there was distance, they tried to close it. If there was confusion, they tried to resolve it. And while this came from a place of care, it also created a pattern. One where emotional reactions were predictable. So the other person always knew. If I do this, they'll respond like that. But then, that changed. Not the care. Not the interest. Just the reaction. They stopped responding immediately. Stopped trying to fix every small shift. Stopped turning moments into explanations. And instead, they allowed things to be. At first, the other person's behavior became more noticeable. More inconsistent. They would say something warm, then go quiet. They would create closeness, then distance. Moments that felt confusing. Almost like mixed signals. But underneath all of it, there was one pattern. They were watching. Waiting. Observing. Trying to understand. Will you react the same way, or not? And when no immediate reaction came, they tried again. Different tone. Different timing. Different approach. Not consciously manipulating, but subconsciously testing the boundaries. And over time, something shifted. The inconsistency faded. The interactions became more stable. Because the old pattern, based on reaction, was no longer being reinforced. And then there was a completely different kind of situation. Not romantic. Not emotional in the same way. A workplace dynamic. One person always over-delivered. Always available. Always responsive. Always trying to meet expectations quickly. And because of that, they became the go-to person. Reliable. Predictable. Expected. But also taken for granted. Not intentionally. Just gradually. Because consistency without boundaries often turns into expectation. So they made a change. Not by becoming distant or disengaged, but by becoming more measured. They responded with intention, not urgency. They didn't jump to solve everything immediately. They allowed space. And almost immediately, something shifted. Requests became more frequent. But also more careful. Tone changed. More respectful. More considerate. And occasionally, small moments of pressure appeared. Subtle follow-ups. Slight urgency. Testing whether the old pattern would return. But it didn't. And because it didn't, a new dynamic formed. One based not on over-availability, but on presence with boundaries. Across all these situations. Different people. Different environments. Different contexts. But the same underlying pattern. When the dynamic changes, the other side responds. Not always clearly. Not always consistently. But predictably enough to recognize. They test what has changed. They look for what remains the same. And they adjust based on what they find. And the outcome is always shaped by one thing. Whether you return to the old pattern or remain steady in the new one. Because the moment you go back, everything resets. But the moment you stay grounded, everything begins to shift. Slowly. Subtly. But undeniably. And once you see this pattern clearly, you stop taking those moments personally. And start recognizing them for what they are. Not confusion. Not games. But transition. So now the question becomes simple. What do you actually do when this starts happening? When you pull back, and you feel those subtle shifts, the mixed signals, the small tests, the moments that try to pull you back into reaction. Because this is where everything either changes or repeats. And the difference is not in what you say. It's in how you hold yourself. So let's make this practical. Not complicated. Not overwhelming. Just clear. The first step is awareness in real time. The moment you feel that internal pull, pause. Not for long. Just enough to notice. What am I about to do, and why? Are you about to respond because it feels natural? Or because you feel the need to stabilize something? That distinction matters. Because one comes from clarity. The other comes from discomfort. And discomfort is not a reliable guide. The second step is to stop reacting to every signal. Not everything requires a response. Not every delay means something. Not every shift needs to be interpreted. Because the more you react, the more you reinforce the idea that your state depends on their behavior. And that brings you back into the old dynamic. So instead, create space. Let moments exist without immediately responding to them. Let silence exist without trying to fill it. Let uncertainty exist without trying to solve it. This is not ignoring. This is not detaching in a cold way. This is stability. The third step is consistency of state. Not consistency of behavior. Because behavior can change. But your internal state should remain steady. Calm. Clear. Grounded. That means you don't become overly available suddenly. You don't disappear dramatically. You don't switch between extremes. You stay centered. Because consistency in your state is what creates trust. Not just for them, but for you. The fourth step is to remove the need for immediate clarity. This is where most people struggle. They want to know. What does this mean? Where is this going? What are they trying to do? And in that need, they rush. They ask. They push. They try to define the situation. But clarity that is forced is rarely accurate. And often temporary. Real clarity comes from observing patterns over time. Without interfering. Without rushing the process. So instead of asking, what does this mean right now? Allow it to reveal itself. And trust that you'll recognize it. Without needing to force it. The fifth step is emotional discipline. Not suppression. Not pretending you don't feel anything. But not letting every feeling dictate your action. You can feel uncertainty without reacting to it. You can feel curiosity without chasing answers. You can feel something shift without trying to control it. And the more you practice this, the more stable you become. Now this is where the real shift happens. Not in what you do, but in who you become. Because when you start applying this consistently, your identity changes. You're no longer the person who reacts to every signal. You're no longer the person who needs constant reassurance. You're no longer the person trying to manage every outcome. You become someone different. Someone who observes before reacting. Someone who allows space without fear. Someone who doesn't rush to fix what feels unclear. And that changes how people experience you. Because most people are used to emotional predictability. Quick reactions. Immediate responses. Visible investment. But when they encounter someone who is steady, not distant, not cold, just grounded, it stands out. And it shifts the dynamic. Because now, your presence is not something they can easily predict. Not because you're playing games, but because you're not operating from reaction. You're operating from self-control. And that creates a different kind of respect. A different kind of attention. A different kind of engagement. And here's the most important part of all of this. You're not doing this to change them. You're not doing this to win anything. You're not doing this to create a specific outcome. You're doing this to remain aligned with yourself. Because the moment your behavior depends on their response, you lose that alignment. And when you stay aligned, everything becomes simpler. You don't need to overthink every moment. You don't need to decode every signal. You don't need to constantly adjust yourself. You just remain consistent in who you are. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. Their behavior. The dynamic. The direction. Not instantly, but naturally. So when those moments come, and they will, you don't panic. You don't chase. You don't try to control. You stay steady. And that steadiness is what changes everything. Because in the end, the moment you stop reacting to every shift is the moment you stop being controlled by them. And the moment you stop needing control is the moment you actually have it.